Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the return of DMH Stallard's employment law webinars. It doesn't seem long ago since July when we were last talking to you through these webinars, but I think it's fair to say that a lot has happened in those brief few weeks, and there's plenty for HR professionals and employment lawyers to be focusing on. I think one of the big areas that a lot of people are looking at now is the issue of agile working and how we work. And I'm joined today by my partner, Stephen Hove.
Hello.
And we'll be talking about the issue of agile working. Now, I'm going to start off, and I'll be looking first of all at what the phrase agile working means, because I think that there's a lot of uncertainty about it, and it means a lot of different things to different people. I'll then look back at the last 6 months and some of the changes that we've seen and try and look at some of the lessons that we can draw from those 6 months in terms of how we look forward to the world of work in the future. Stephen's then going to look at the law. He's going to address some of the legal principles that are relevant to the issue of agile working. And we'll have some examples of how different organisations are beginning to approach the issue. Now, just one or two pieces of housekeeping. You should see at the bottom of your screens the chat box and the Q&A. If you've got any technology issue, any problem with hearing us, etc., then can you use the chat function? If you have a question about what we're talking about, could you use the Q&A function, and that will get fed through to us so that we can then have a look at it and we'll talk through it at the end of the session. What I will also say is that if we're not able to get to any of your questions during the session, we'll prepare a Q&A document that we'll circulate after the webinar. Okay, so as I say, let's start by looking at the issue of, well, what is agile working? And I thought the easiest way to find out was to use that famous research tool, Google. So I simply Googled agile working. And it very helpfully came up with a series of different definitions, which really did make the point quite strongly that agile working does mean different things to different people. But what I'll do is I'll run through them and hopefully we'll see some themes that come up and we'll draw a conclusion at the end. So first of all, the British Computer Society, what do they say agile working is? They say it's a way of working in which an organisation empowers its people to work where, when and how they choose, with maximum flexibility and minimum constraints to optimise their performance and to do their best work. I think the thing that comes out of this definition is that the focus is very much upon the employee. So it does make reference to when and where they work, which is a common theme. But it's looking at the employee, making sure that the agile working is used to optimize their performance and that they're able to do their best work. So it focuses, as I say, on the employee's performance. It also makes the reference to empowerment and the element of choice within the employee. So moving on to the next slide, the agile organization, what do they say? Well, they say agile working is about bringing people, processes, connectivity and technology, time and place together to find the most appropriate and effective way of working to carry out a particular task. So one thing you notice about that definition is it moves away from talking about empowerment of the employee and it moves towards talking about completion of a particular task. So the focus is more on what the employer wants to get done. It does again make the reference to time and place. But I think what's key about this definition are the references to processes, connectivity and technology. I think that connectivity and technology are the absolute heart of agile working. And I also believe that processes are at the heart of agile working. And as I say, we'll see at the end of the session a fantastic example of how processes, flexibility in terms of time and place, connectivity and technology are all brought together for the benefit of the employer. The next definition, office principles, you might understand that they have a focus towards the office environment. What they say is, Agile working is all about creating a flexible office and productive environment. By creating different working areas within the office, you can ensure your staff have the complete freedom and flexibility to work where they want and when they want. So again, that theme of where and when, but also talking about the office environment. And to me, that conjures up pictures of things like shared space, collaboration areas, breakout areas, hot desking. All of those things that we have begun to see within the working environment as the working environment has been modernized. So that's talking about flexibility, particularly by reference to the working environment. Moving on, an IT company, and called IT Pro, what do they say? This is quite an interesting one. Agile working is all about the business. An Agile project is where research, planning, design, development, and testing all happen in parallel. It allows for continuous improvements to be made throughout the process, with a new system only going live when it's demonstrated the service works and meets the user's needs. So there, the focus is so much upon process, and it's talking about the different elements of the organization's processes relating to research, planning, design, development, etc., all happening in parallel. So it's a refunctioning, a re-engineering of how the organization works. So much less focus on the employee and empowerment of the employee, much more focus on how the business operates. They don't ignore the employee, and they make the point that an agile workforce can work from home, from coffee shops, or even the park. So, as I say, not forgetting the employee, but the focus is on the employer's processes. But the one I like best is the next one. Our friends at CIPD, what do they say? Well, they say, looking at workforce agility, the Agile Future Forum, and they adopt this definition, describes agile working as a set of practices that allow businesses to establish an optimal workforce and provide the benefits of a greater match between the resources and the demand for services, increase productivity, and improve talent attraction and retention. And they go on to say these practices span 4 dimensions. Well, before I look at those 4 dimensions, the thing I like about this definition is it's talking about some of the outcomes of agile working, and it makes reference to aligning resources and the demand for services more effectively, improving the match there, increasing productivity. And very importantly, it makes reference to improving talent attraction and retention. And I think that that is a thing for all employers to keep in mind, that we're working with a different generation, and increasingly we'll be working with employees who have different expectations about the way that they work. 10 years ago, I remember talking at one of DMH Stallard's breakfast workshops and talking about how work might change in the future. And 10 years ago, I was talking about the possibility of the old style employment relationship changing, moving towards more people working on a casual basis. And of course, we've seen a lot of that, people working as consultants on 0 hours contracts, all the different working arrangements. And I think that the pace of that is only going to increase. I think in the next 10 years, we'll see that accelerate. So young people today will have firm ideas about the way they want to work. And one of the key benefits of agile working is that you can accommodate some of those ideas. You can allow them to have greater control about when and where they work. You can keep the involvement with the employer. They still feel engaged. So that's why I think this definition has a big attraction, because it really focuses on what benefits are of agile working and particularly retention. But moving on to, sorry, Jordan, the previous slide again, please. But moving on to those 4 factors, they're talking about time and location, common themes throughout. They're talking about role, about what people do. And I think that that's a critical element when you look at agile working. It's not just about when people work and where they work. It's about the role that they perform, about expanding their skills, multi-skilling, making them flexible within the workforce, moving to different parts of the organization, job rotation, things like that. And then source, again, it's an important element of the definition for me. I think that we have to think very carefully about the type of workers that we engage. So do we need to have regular employees carrying out a particular function? Can we outsource the function? Can we have freelancers? Can we use 0 hours contracts? Because all of those different types of workers will have different demands and expectations in terms of how the business operates. And it's important to think about these things at the same time, because let's face it, if you outsource the work, then issues of when and where people will be working are much less relevant. If you engage contractors, they become more relevant because people will need to have a choice about when and where they're working. Then moving on, CIPD goes on in their definition to say, with regard to processes, structures, and ways of working, CIPD defines agility as the ability to stay open to new directions and be continually proactive, helping to assess the limits or indeed risks of existing approaches, and ensuring that leaders and followers have an agile and change-ready mindset to enable them and ultimately the organization to keep moving, changing, and adapting. Well, I think that the situation that we're currently in is the most powerful example of how and when we need to deploy these skills. We do at this time need to be adaptable and to be flexible. And so therefore the CIPD definition it hits the nail on the head. It's now that we need to be agile and change ready. We need to be thinking about how we do work. Okay, so those are some of the definitions of agile working, which I hope helps you get the idea that agile working is about a lot of different things to different people, but there are some key themes. Don't confuse agile working with flexible working. Flexible working is a more limited concept. So flexible working is a way of working that suits an employee's needs, and the focus is primarily on when the individual will be working and where the individual will be working. It is an element of agile working, and it's an important element to understand. And Stephen's going to go on to talk about the relevance of flexible working and requests in the context of agile working. But whilst agile working may contain an element of flexible working, it's about a lot more. As I say, it's a discussion about empowerment of employees, about giving employees choice. It's a discussion about optimizing their performance. It's a discussion about the organization's processes. Critically, it's a discussion about connectivity and technology. That's absolutely the heart of the concept of agile working. So, as I say, it's a much broader concept than just when and where are our workforce going to be working. Okay, so I'm going to pause now and ask you all a question, and we'll have one of our online polls. So the question is, have you introduced new forms of agile working since March? Or do you think it likely that you will introduce new forms of agile working? And you have the choice of yes, no, or unsure. So press, make your selection and click on your answer. And probably in 30 seconds or so, we'll begin to get a response. Right, so just waiting for it to build with bated breath. I was complaining earlier on this morning that I understand that people who are logging in and participating in the survey don't get a attractive graph showing whether they're in the majority or the minority as the answers feed through. But I can say that we've now got the answers, and perhaps not surprisingly, 79% of our respondents say that they have introduced new forms of agile working, or they think that it's likely that they will. As a small 14% say no, they haven't introduced new forms of agile working, and 7% of us are unsure. So that's interesting, because what it does show is that it is a topic that's important to a lot of organizations. Okay, well, let's go on to look at the last 6 months. What have we seen? And what lessons might we be able to learn from that period? So let's take ourselves back to March of this year and lockdown. If we move to the next slide. Initially, I think most organizations had a period of crisis management. The priorities were the health of staff, quite naturally. Huge worry about the risks to the welfare of staff, complications in relation to shielding, etc. There was also a priority for most organizations to try and maintain continuity of service to their clients and customers, quite naturally. And there was a race to prepare to work from home. So, our team here had to equip a lot of people to work from home who hadn't previously been working from home. After that, things moved on to resource management. So we, at an early stage, a lot of clients were assessing the resources that they required. And I can remember before the furlough scheme was introduced, there were clients that were looking very hard at the resources they need. They were looking at staff numbers and looking at the possibility of large-scale redundancies. Furlough came along, and it was a little bit of a life belt. It has helped to maintain a lot of traditional employment relationships, but we know only lasts to the end of October. I think, who knows, but the job support scheme doesn't offer the same support, and I fear that there'll be a lot of organisations that will now be looking in October about restructurings and looking at reducing the numbers of staff that are employed. But I think alongside that, we need to be thinking about alternatives to restructuring, and that would be thinking through some of the processes, seeing whether redundancies can be avoided. We then quite quickly had a recognition of some of the benefits of agile working, and I think that this is where we begin to learn some of the lessons from the last 6 months. So some were obvious, such as reduced travel. I mean, most people welcomed the fact that they didn't have their typical commute into work. Most people found ease of home working was relatively easy. That's perhaps a bold statement to make. That certainly doesn't apply to everybody. I think that for some people, working from home, for whatever reason, was tough. And clearly that needs to be something that is factored in. Home working isn't for everybody. We certainly had, I think, an acceptance of home working as legitimate. We've operated a flexible working policy at DMH Stallard for several years. But I think that what changed was that as people work from home across the board, there was an acceptance that people were able to find their own ways of working and work effectively whilst working from home, choosing the times when they worked. We also found that technology coped with the problems. I think technology across the board in all organisations has tended to step up to the demands of agile working and remote working. We had an acceptance of things like virtual meetings. Historically, everybody's always said, well, it's imperative to meet face-to-face, in person. But I think that people now understand that virtual meetings, they might not be a perfect substitute for meeting face-to-face, but they do work on the whole very well. And very importantly, from a financial perspective, we had an early recognition that for a lot of organizations, there was a reduced need for office space. And that has significant implications for the bottom line. So there's some real benefits to agile working that we've learned of over the last 6 months. But there have been some downsides, and these are going to have to be thought through as we move forward in terms of how we set up our workforces. As I've said, Agile working doesn't work for everyone, and remote working doesn't work for everyone. For some people, it's difficult. Some people don't like it. They like the fact that they can work with colleagues, and I think there we have to look at what works for the individuals. We have to cater for the individuals. We have to provide options and alternatives. So it might be that they can work from home. Equally, it might be that they can come into an office space. That office space might look very different to of the office space that existed prior to March. It might involve, as I say, collaboration areas. We might utilize that sense of collaboration and working together. Isolation is a key issue. Organizations have quickly recognized that there is a potentially damaging impact of individuals working alone, damaging impact on mental health. These now are recognized as serious issues in most workplaces. There's a much greater focus on mental health over the last 5 years. People recognize the importance of looking after their staff's well-being. And so that's a factor that we have to think through for the future arrangements. Workplace collaboration. It's just that much more difficult for colleagues to work together when they're not within touching distance of each other. A good example is induction of employees. It is much more difficult to take on a new member of staff, to help them to feel comfortable, to help them to understand the workplace. Trivial things such as where things are found, how systems work, if they're not within touching distance of their colleagues, and we have to plan and work out how we're going to get over that problem. Workplace cultures. Again, if we're trying to generate a strong workplace culture of whatever nature, and if that's important to our organization, how are we going to do that if people are working remotely, if we have less contact with them? And it is, I think, an unwise employer that ignores these issues. Maybe over a 6-month period, workplace culture can go a little bit on the back burner, but it can't go on the back burner in the long term. So we've got to be thinking about ways of, okay, if we change how our organization operates, how are we going to maintain a culture across the organization? Okay, so moving to the next slide, I think that there is currently a need for employers to rethink how they operate. And what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about as we're taking decisions about how we're going to use our workforce in the future? Well, the first and obvious one is a return to the workplace, question mark. We live in uncertain times. I mean, a month ago, the return to the workplace was taking place at pace. People were planning very hard about how to enable staff to return to the workplace, putting in place all sorts of complex plans to make sure that the workplace was safe. And 2 weeks ago or so, we began to have a concern about whether that was possible, and organizations have begun to rethink whether that return to the workplace can take place. A lot of organizations have continued, but I think a lot of organizations realize now that there is a real risk that in the next few weeks or months, there'll be restrictions placed on the ability of staff to return to work. Another thing organizations need to be thinking about is whether there is a need to restructure, to think about their use of resources. So it's partly about the number of individuals and staff that are engaged, but critically it's about what type of workers are needed. Again, it goes back to, are there functions that we can outsource? Do we need to engage people on a different basis, a self-employed basis, a casual basis, etc.? I've said it's not just a question of reducing headcount. For many organizations, it's a time when we need to be reviewing how we operate as an organization. looking at things like processes, looking at a lot of the factors that we've been talking about within the definitions that we saw earlier. And these are all decisions that need to be made within a much broader context. So we've got the context of the employment relationship. I mentioned those feelings of isolation and concern for employees' well-being. Yeah, how are we going to address that? You know, ideas are encouraging staff to get out and about, encouraging staff to go for a coffee, rather than just stay working in their homes for 5 days a week, encouraging staff to exercise, socialize where possible, encouraging staff to get together, perhaps virtually. We've got to think about the employment relationship in relation to how the employee or how the worker feels about work. What about their career development? A lot of organizations have struggled to deal with career development and progression where staff are working from home. So I think we need to have an increased focus on development and support for individual employees. So one-to-ones that maybe took place monthly need to take place more regularly. Another area that workers complain of when they work remotely is feeling that they have less of a say in the workplace environment. If you're working together, you have the ear of your colleagues, you have the ear of your managers, and perhaps in a casual way. But if you're working at home, you don't have that communication. How do you make sure that employees continue to feel engaged, that they're listened to, that their ideas are taken into account, that their opinions are taken into account? So the employment relationship itself has a bearing on our thoughts as in terms of how we're going to move forward. The environment we work in, I've already referred to COVID and the uncertainties that brings. Government policy, that brings its uncertainties as well. You know, what's going to happen in relation to Brexit? How's that going to impact our businesses? How's it going to impact the way that we work? Government policy in the context of COVID. Is the government going to encourage people to return to the workplace? Is the government going to discourage people from the return? Government policy in terms of legislation generally. You know, what changes might happen to things like 0 hours contracts. So there's much broader context. And as I say, we've got to think hard about the organization's needs. And there's no point doing this if there's no benefit to the organization. We've talked about the need for an organization to have a collaborative workforce. How do you develop a culture whereby people who work agilely in the ways that I've described still are managed effectively and contribute to the goals of the business? So it's working out how do we support our leaders and our managers to manage and lead a very different type of workforce potentially. So there are a lot of things to think about. Yeah, I'll leave you with words of optimism in the sense that it's not impossible. And at the end of the session, I'm going to give you a stunning example of how this can work, where an organization has set up remote working to work effectively both for the worker and to the profit of the organization. But for now, I'll leave you with that promise, and I'm going to hand over to Stephen to talk about some of the legal aspects that we need to be thinking about.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was very interesting. What I'm going to look at is the position you find yourself in once your processes are agreed and you need to come to some form of agreement with your employees, or your employees decide that they want a shift in the way that they work and they approach you. So those are the subjects that I'm going to be looking at this morning, and I'll zip through them pretty quickly because they are innumerable and we won't go into any great detail, but I hope that they provoke thought. I need to make a couple of apologies first. The first is that I touch on flexible working requests, which my colleague Will Walsh did a little piece on in July. So my talk will be slightly repetitive for that reason. And I've also been living in the peaceful countryside for about the last 6 months, but some workers have decided today to dig up the road outside my office. So if we hear a slight rumble in the background, that's the reason for that noise. To begin at the beginning, it's easy to forget that people, employers and employees, can largely agree to any form of agile and flexible working. The law gives them a great deal of scope to agree whatever they really wish to. There's very little constraint in the law as to what you can agree and you can't agree if you look at it in the round. We're often, as employment lawyers and HR professionals, concerned with the precise regulation of individual areas of employment law. But the truth is, if everybody agrees, you have very wide scope to agree any form of agile, flexible working that you wish. You've just got to remember that you've got to put it in a contract, and to remind you all of what the basic terms of a contract are, there must be an intention to agree legal relations. There must be an offer and acceptance. And the offer need not come from the employer, it can come from the employee. There must be consideration between the parties, and usually that means that the employee will work, and that means the employee will pay for that work. But that's not necessarily the case. Anything of value will work. And there has to be certainty. Whatever you agree has to be sufficiently clearly set out that, if necessary, a judge can look at it and think, yes, I can understand what these people wanted to say when they wanted to agree when they entered into this agreement. So moving on, if you have those things, you have a legally enforceable agreement. Now, of course, there are some constraints in employment law that don't exist in other areas of law or most other areas of contract law. A court will not order specific performance of a contract of employment. So usually you can't be compelled to work out your notice, for example. You have a legal obligation as an employee to work out your notice, but your employer can't get an order from the court compelling you to do so. One party who's in repudiatory breach of an employment contract, the other party doesn't have to terminate the contract. It doesn't terminate the contract. That's quite unusual in employment respects. But the law recognizes that employers and employees don't have equal bargaining power in most cases. And so the law does intervene. And I thought that I would set out very briefly the main areas of intervention as I see it in the context of agreeing to agile and flexible working. So moving on, there obviously is the national minimum wage, although that's a little bit more flexible than you might think. You have to pay the national minimum wage if you're an employer, and if you agree with an employee not to pay them the national minimum wage, it's void. You need to set out the terms of employment in a Section 1 statement. You need to give your employees a certain amount of working time. They can't work beyond the maximum working time, but of course, as we all know, you can opt out of that. If you impose excessive restrictive covenants on your employees, the court won't enforce them. It'll find that they're illegal. An employer can't assign an employment contract to somebody else, which is the purpose of TUPE, because TUPE overcomes that common law rule. So where an employer assigns its business to somebody else, transfers its business to somebody else in some circumstances, then TUPE applies to allow an assignment of employment contracts which otherwise would not take place. And employee obligations cannot be enforced by a third party. I can't decide to substitute myself for somebody else if I'm employed by an employer. So moving on, please. Employees, as we know, have the right to apply for flexible working. They have the right to make a request for changes to their terms of employment governing how and when they work. The request has to be dealt with in a reasonable manner, and as we know, the request can only be refused for prescribed business reasons that are set out in the Employment Rights Act, Section 80, and on the correct facts. Ineligible employees can, of course, make an informal request, and you must be careful that you don't discriminate against employees who are making a request for flexible working based on a protected characteristic. Next, please. The request must be dated in writing and say that it's made under Section 80 of the Employment Rights Act, set out the change that's requested, indicate a start date, explain what effect it is perceived as having on the employer and how that effect may be addressed, confirm whether a previous request has been made, and if so, when. And as Will neatly put in his little box here, you're to discuss, deliberate over it, deal with it, and without delay, give an answer to the employee. Moving on, please. A rejection must be based on a genuine belief that a valid ground for refusal applies. And I think this genuine belief is something which is going to cause employers more problems going on in the future than it has in the past. Fairness and reasonable is not relevant, but an assessment of the factual basis for belief is relevant. So it must be rooted in some issue that the employer has, which entitles them to turn down the request. The valid grounds, as you probably know, and they're worth briefly reciting: the burden of additional costs, detrimental effect on the ability to meet customer demand, inability to reorganize work amongst existing staff, inability to recruit additional staff, detrimental impact on quality, ditto on performance, insufficiency of work during the period you propose to work, client structural changes. It seems to me that after COVID, these all seem to be a little bit old-fashioned, and that one can see that one could overcome most of them going forward. Next slide, please, Jordan. The most surprising thing about the last few months, if you think about it, is that employers have been approaching employees with flexible working requests rather than the other way round. So whereas employers have had to deal with requests from employees for flexible working, quite the opposite has happened in the last few months. And employees have been requested to do things that they have never been asked to do before, and very quickly indeed. An obvious example is the furlough scheme itself operates as an agreed variation to an employee's contract, which is why the guidance suggests that you have the agreement in writing, not only so you can prove that you put the people on furlough, but you know what the terms of the agreement were with your employees. Now, most employees have no doubt agreed to be furloughed where they had been, due to a lack of a viable alternative, either being laid off on a very minimum amount of money or being made redundant. But I wonder how difficult it will now be for employers to refuse to prescribe business reason and on the correct facts, on the basis that they have a genuine belief that there's a valid ground for refusal, when they themselves have been asking their employees to be enormously flexible in the way that they work, and enormously agile as well, in my view. Jordan, next slide, please. My guess is it'll be much more difficult. I also suspect that employees may start to point to the contractual options available only to employers, or usually available only to employers, such as mobility clauses, home working, role flexibility, flexibility on hours and shifts, all at the behest usually of the employer, and argue that they should apply equally to employees, perhaps despite the strict contractual position that they do not. But I think in some cases, you'll find that mobility clauses, home working, etc., on the face of the contract itself operate both ways. So that's another interesting area, I think, for debate, because you won't need a flexible working request. You can actually use the terms of the contract to assist you in your negotiations with your employer. And of course, the employer itself can use these clauses much more vigorously than they used to do, having got used to doing it so far this year. Moving on, please. I thought I would very briefly touch on a couple of things which one might want to keep in mind when considering agile and flexible working. And these are really things I'm not going to go into in considerable detail, and indeed some of them I have no particular expertise in, but I think it would be remiss of Simon and me not to mention them. The first is obviously your obligation to the health and safety of your staff. Now, this has been uppermost in the COVID period, but it is an ongoing obligation, as you will all know. And to put it very briefly, you must carry out a risk assessment if you employ anybody. And if you employ more than 4 people, that assessment has to be in writing. You also have to consult with your workforce about your health and safety issues, particularly those who are clinically vulnerable. If you're going to have a dispersed workforce, you will have to look at the dispersed workforce workplaces, if they are permanent, if they're outside your usual office or factory environment. And if people are clinically vulnerable, Simon mentioned people who would not enjoy working at home in the long term, you're going to have to consult with them carefully as to the regime that you're going to apply to them, if as the employer you wish them to work in a particular way. And I would suggest that even if it's of their own choice, you should investigate the choice and interrogate it quite carefully. There are other points that obviously arise, it seems to me. How do you supervise a workforce if it's disparate, if it's dispersed? I think it's a little easier for target-driven sales businesses, as we will see from the examples at the end. It's more difficult, I would suggest, to supervise a workforce which doesn't have clear performance indicators. Confidentiality is another problem. If your workforce is not confined to an office with the confidential material there, but is everywhere, confidentiality is going to be a much more serious problem than it was in the past, although this is a problem that most employers are already coming to grips with because of the nature of mobile phones, laptops, etc. This has been a problem which has been partly resolved by the law, but partly not, and which I think will become an increasing one over the next few years. Restrictive covenants. I think we don't have a problem with restrictive covenants so far as protecting one's clients are concerned, or protecting one's employees from being poached. But I think if you have a disparate workforce, restricting the area in which someone can compete with you is going to be even more difficult in the future than it is at the moment. Moving on, please. And a few other bits and pieces. Insurance. You are the employer and you require insurance, compulsory insurance for your employees. Your insurers may think that your employees are in a single office building or 3 or 4 office buildings, whereas in fact they may be in 100 different locations. If that's the case, you're going to have to advise your insurers of where your employees are actually working if their move is permanent. Employees who operate from an office in their own home on a permanent basis will have to advise their insurance company that that is what they're doing, because their insurer is insuring a dwelling home and not an office space. Now, individual insurance policies may allow for a certain amount of office space within a house, but this is something I think you need to question with your employees. The terms of your employees' mortgage. If they've got a mortgage on their house, the mortgage company may not permit any form of office work at all. And your employees may want to query that with the insurance company. Likewise, those who live on developments or in flats, there may be a development deed of covenant or a covenant in a lease, which simply prevents people from working at home at all. Sometimes it doesn't, but it's worth thinking about. Planning permission. My understanding of planning permission, and this is not my area of expertise, is that certain basic office accommodation within a house does not require planning permission. But I know people who currently have 5 members of their family working from home, and it seems to me that their home is a home until 9 a.m, and then it becomes an office until 5:30. And that, I suggest, is another area where we need to tread quite carefully. Relocation is an interesting one as well. You have an employee who now wishes to work for you from France. Well, they may end up being resident in France, not only for the purposes of employment law, which will be tricky enough for you to manage because they're bound to want to use French employment law against you, but also they'll be taxed in a different way if they're resident in France rather than resident in this country. So be careful if somebody wants to relocate abroad. And then London waiting, that's an interesting one. At the moment, those who commute into London get London waiting, or those who live in London get London waiting. But what happens if the London waiting is really for a commuting population only? Those who are outside London may start to object that those who apparently commute into London but no longer do so still get London waiting. They might want London waiting shared. So that's an interesting one as well, I think, and something to be kept in mind when considering this whole business of agile and flexible working. Next slide, please. I have an architectural practice as a client who designs office space, and they recently carried out a poll of their clients. Prior to COVID, office space in central London was utilised at about 75 to 80%, which I thought was a surprisingly low figure, actually. It was reduced to 25% during lockdown, which I think is quite a high figure. Their clients in this poll believe that utilisation will rise only to 50% post-COVID. So, next slide. I have a question for you. What do you think your post-COVID office occupancy will be? Do you think it'll stay at 20%, go up to 50%, go back to 75%, or do you think people will rush back to work and it'll be 100%? The questions should be now on your screen. As Simon says, unfortunately, you can't see the results. Well, I'll give them to you once we know them in about 30 seconds' time. Right, the figures are in. Interestingly, pretty much as my architectural practice believed, 20% as it now is, only 10% of you think that that will remain the case, which is encouraging. 50% occupancy, more than 50% of you think that you'll go to 50%. 33% of you hope that it'll be at 75%, and interestingly, 6% of people think they'll be back to 100% occupancy. That's very interesting indeed, and broadly backs up the poll of my client. So moving on. So what are the implications of all of this? Well, Simon and I have asked a few of our clients what they intend to do in the future. And one of my clients is a sales company in IT. So it has a number of, its staff are mainly young and very, very computer connected. They occupied a very large office in central London. And when COVID struck, they simply sent everybody home. At the same time, they reduced their office space by 80%. They have divided their teams into 3 teams, and each of those teams has Zoom meetings every day to keep team coherence together. And they go into the office, the 20% that's left of the office space, in turn every other day to have face-to-face sales meetings, which I thought was quite interesting. So this company has simply used COVID as a mechanism permanently to disperse its workforce and to reduce its office space in central London. Now, as I said, it's a sales company, so performance is easy to monitor. And so one would hope that will work well for them. I've got another client who's a recruiter who is going to retain its office space, but it's going to pay its employees by performance only. Now, of course, the national minimum wage impinges on this if they remain employees and workers, but essentially they're going to pay their employees for the sales that they make, and they can take as many days holiday as they wish, and they can come into work wherever they wish. I should say that they haven't finalised their plans yet, but that is what they intend to do in the near future. Now, I'm going to ask Simon to join again, because our last example is really, I think, the most interesting one, and Simon is going to go through it, of how you can look at process, create a platform where you can have a whole business process and use agile working in order to make that process work really well to the benefit of both the employer and the employees. So Simon, if I could pass over to you to finish off our examples.
Thanks, Stephen. So if we could just move to the next slide. So the example that I'm going to give you is it's a company based in Australia. It operates globally, and the services that it provides is to provide coaching services to university students and also school students where English is not their first language. So the idea is that the student will produce a piece of work, that the company will pick up that piece of work online, and it will arrange for one of its tutors to go through the piece of work from the point of view of English language. So it will be correcting to a degree, commas and full stops, etc. Particularly where, as I say, the student doesn't have English as their first language, there'll be quite a lot of adjustments that are suggested by the tutor. So you can see that it's breaking down what might previously be done by an expensive university professor and giving that job, first of all, to a language tutor. The piece of work then goes back to the student then submits it to the university professor to assess the merits of the work otherwise. So all the pieces of student work, if they want it to be reviewed in this way, go into a pool, and the organisation gives that piece of work a value and a fee by reference to the length of the piece of work. So if it's a 2,000 word essay, it gets a particular fee associated with it. Then one of the tutors that's engaged by this company, and they can be based anywhere in the world, will go into that pool of work and will select a piece of work to then assess by reference to language, etc. The tutor is given a limited amount of time in which to carry out that task, which means that you don't get students waiting for a long time to receive a piece of feedback because it's blocked in the system. Invariably, the time that the tutor has to spend marking the piece of work, or I shouldn't say marking, but assessing the piece of work and giving some thoughts in terms of English language, is far longer than the fee or the value that has been assessed. The feedback's given. The organisation has set up an online chat room for the tutors to support each other, so that if a tutor is looking at a piece of work, doesn't know how to deal with a particular problem with the piece of work, they go online, they chat to other tutors, well, how would you deal with this, etc. Of course, the tutors aren't paid for doing that because they just get the set fee for doing the piece of assessment. Recruitment of tutors is all via online test. So anybody who wants to apply to be a tutor has to complete an online test. All the induction is online, all the training is online. And the ultimate outcome is that not a word is spoken between employer and employee, i.e. the tutor. Not a word is spoken between the tutor and the student to whom they're providing services. Yet the tutors, because there is an elaborate system of support through the ability to go into the chat rooms, feel supported and they feel engaged. There's communication between the company and the tutors who, as I say, may be based all over the world through online communication. And you can see that what the organisation gets out of it is that they can recruit from across the world, so they have a global talent pool. They can recruit at minimal cost because there is no expensive process of interviewing. They can train at no cost, in the sense that all they have to do is to prepare the material and then give it to the online tutors for them to understand and comprehend. They can support at no cost by establishing the chat room for tutors to support each other. And they can monitor quality of the tutor's work through the feedback that is given by the students. And it struck me that that was a classic example of how you bring processes, connectivity, technology together. You combine it with giving the tutors the opportunity to work where and when they want, and is, to me, a most fantastic example of agile working.
That is the main benefit, is it, to the tutors themselves, Simon, that they have complete flexibility. They do it whenever they want.
Yeah, I mean, it's perfect for anybody who wants to be able to pick and choose entirely how much work they do, when they do it, and how they do it. So it's an ideal job for somebody who has the ability to do the work and seeks the ultimate inflexibility as to how they work and when they work. Okay, well, I hope that example is a useful way of bringing to life some of the things we've been talking about. Just looking at the questions that have come in, there are a few, so we've got a few minutes left. The first question, Stephen, I think is one for you. You mentioned about risk assessments, and the question that's come in is, with the risk assessment required when you employ more than 4 people, is that 4 in total or just 4 flexibly? Or
no, that's 4 in total. So your obligation, no, you've got to do a risk assessment per se. You have to do a written risk assessment when you have more than 4 employees. So it doesn't matter where they are. In the past, of course, they were all in the same place. They were all in your office, or they were all in your factory. But that may not be the case in the future. And my suggestion is that you need to think about the risks posed by the place where they work remotely. And certainly the organizations that I know who have always had remote working carry out a health and safety assessment of for example, the home working environment of the individual who works from home as a normal part of their health and safety assessment.
Yeah. I think that's a worry for a lot of employers.
Yep.
How do they undertake an effective health and safety assessment of individuals when they're working at home?
I think all of these things, mortgages, insurance, health and safety, are likely to change and also become more flexible themselves in the future to encourage the sort of remote working that we've been seeing. So we'll have to see what happens. So what appear to be problems and impediments at the moment probably will be worked out between the interested parties over time, I suspect.
Stephen, I've got another question for you that's come through, which that is, traditionally we have contracts with a designated place of work as an office or a home worker. Is agile working an appropriate definition for future contracts? Would this need to be clarified in terms of an individual role or organisation? And can I ask you also, perhaps in just the minute that we've got left, to address another question, which is that where we have a change in working arrangement, should we issue a new contract?
Right. To answer that first, it depends how wide-ranging your change is. My own view is that a letter varying a contract, setting out a couple of simple changes, would be sufficient. But if you're going to really rethink your processes, as you were discussing, Simon, then you might want to revisit your contracts completely and produce new ones. Of course, you would then have to go through consultation with your employees, set out the reasons why. But if you've got a future idea about where you want your business to go, that probably is an essential part of the process anyway, I would have thought. Traditionally, you've got contracts at a designated place of work. If you want to make that wider, then you're going to have to change your contracts, because you don't have, unless you've got a really good mobility clause in your contract, you won't have the contractual right to vary the clause to get people to work more flexibly elsewhere. So you will have to change the contract itself. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you, Stephen. Well, that brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. Just quickly, I'll mention that in a couple of weeks' time, we've got a further webinar talking about the issue of COVID and changes to support arrangements and the job support scheme. So, as I say, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you found it interesting, and I look forward to seeing you shortly. Bye.